many of you I saw last night, and you stuck to your commitment to come. So that's what's up. I don't know. Maybe I would have done the same thing. Maybe not. Anyway, my name's Brandon Campbell Kearns. I'm just working on window management here. Not ignoring you. My name's Brandon Campbell Kearns, and I'm here to talk to you about learning. I've titled this talk "Learning the Hard Way" because the thesis is that organizations, tech organizations specifically, as well as individuals within them, need to take agency of their educational endeavors, right? Learning often gets, bucketed into this, like, hey, here's a stipend for you to take some classes, or we'll have a lunch and learn every so often, which is cool. Those are all parts of what can be successful approaches. I'm here to just share some anecdotes and experiences of other approaches that have also been successful, and I'd argue more holistic to both individuals in organizations and the organizations themselves. So having said that, we'll get into it. So this talk is being brought to you by Lion's Mane. If you've never had Lion's Mane, you definitely should. I have it every day. Keeps my brain the way it is, which I like to think is a good way. I have a packet here, an extra one, for whoever gets the quiz question right. Serious business. Okay, let's get into it. Oops. So I'll start by just talking a little bit about why this is something that matters to me, and that's going to start with me talking about my journey into education. This is a photo of one of my classrooms from 2011. That's one of my students hiding, not trying to be in the picture. I taught English in Korea. Little funny story, that's a picture of me on the wall. They used to draw pictures. There's another one of me. A lot of them were a little sus. But anyway, that's when I first endeavored into education or teaching. I thought it would be really easy because I know English. And I'm like, yeah, I got this. I'm just going to teach them how to do it. But I was so far removed from being an English learner, right, that it was difficult. I think I was successful, but it was not as easy as I thought, right? So once I returned to the States, spent some time figuring out what I wanted out of life, etc. And that led me to General Assembly. Shout out to GA. Any GA grads in the house? There's one. Is there in the front? Two? Yes. Or any other boot camp. Yeah, it doesn't have to be GA. All right. Respect. Cool. So I went there and learned how to build web applications. And then very shortly after learning, I became an instructor. So this is my first front-end web development course, where I was the lead. I was a TA really shortly after. And that's a thread that we'll kind of get into later. The idea for me was I just learned it. Maybe it would help me out to teach it too. Kind of reckless, didn't have a ton of credibility. There's a lot of imposter syndrome, a lot of sweaty t-shirts, hoping they don't catch me in a lie, but it ended up working out. No lies were told. Continued to teach at GA. Shout out to that photographer. Right? They came to work. So then after that, I became Home Depot's first bootcamp hire. And these are just some photos of inside the Home Depot office. You all know what an office looks like. This is a distribution center that we got to tour. And then this is just some more work that we were doing. I was struggling to find photos. I didn't do a lot of selfies, while I was coding. But that's just some proving, that I was there. After I left that role in 2019, I started to work at this company called Galvanize. And the approach there was basically educational consulting. So we would go travel. And the first client I landed on was USAA. This is a picture outside of their beautiful office in San Antonio, Texas. And we'll talk more about that later. During that, so we were just, again, ideating with teams to either build new products or add new features to existing products from the ground up in some cases. Shortly after that, got asked to do a project with the Department of Defense. This slide is not a ton of value. It's just what some of our ideation, the day we learned that we were going to Hawaii, we started right then, like trying to figure out what would be the appropriate curricula and approaches for teaching them. Considering that we didn't know this at the time, but the airmen that we ended up with had zero coding experience. In some cases, like, did not have like high computer literacy. Just meaning like they didn't know how to use a Mac. I guess I could have said that. Yeah, and this is us in the classroom. That is, yeah, those are all the airmen right there. I think Tom got cut off at the top, but there were 6 of them, had them paired up. 6 weeks. This was straddling COVID, so March 17th, 2020. That was that day. That's why the sad tear had to leave and then went back and continued class. So all of this just to introduce a bit of my history. We'll get into more of that and tie it into the rest of the talk. But the thesis here that I'm making spans across 2 groups. One of those groups are the individuals within organizations, and then also the decision makers within the organizations who represent that organization and make choices on behalf of it. So the real fundamental question is, how can each of these parties, collectively, individually, create and nurture a learning practice for themselves, whether that's an individual or an organization which is made up of individuals, as you know. Same slide. Great, so we'll start with individuals and talk about some strategies for effectively learning from and educating your peers, which is, in my view, a very important thing to have. A really safe and psychologically safe learning culture is necessary for a company. So I've got 3 approaches here for individuals, and then we'll do the same thing for organizations. When you are beginning a learning journey within an organization as an individual, it can seem very overwhelming if you try to become an expert across the entire tech stack or try to learn everything about the business units of the company. So don't do that. Pick a narrow vertical that you can, that's maybe like something that maybe not everybody thinks about often. For me, that ended up being version control at Home Depot. They were using SVN when I got there. And at General Assembly, I learned Git and GitHub. So that's all I knew. That was my competitive advantage without really having to work. So the value there was, oh, the company happened to be switching over to Git and GitHub. So I was like, yeah, I'm going to put together a slide deck and show folks what's up. So that began the process of me getting that reputation for being someone who could share knowledge. And then that grew into bigger things, which we'll talk about. Right, so in your early career, it's about identifying a SME, subject matter expert. I gave this talk on LinkedIn Live, and somebody said, I don't know what a SME is, so sorry. I'm going to break that down. Subject matter expert. Because, like I said, you might not be that person coming fresh out of whatever experience you came from, whether it's college or self-taught or boot camp. But if you're not able to identify a willing SME, then it's got to be you. If you're really about this commitment to learning, and that's going to be hard. That's how come she's pushing that boulder up the mountain there. I hear you, a little laugh. Okay, but as you progress in your career, mid-level to senior, I'm arguing that that's about finding an actual area of expertise for yourself, such that you can be the resource, the person that folks go to get knowledge. But I'm not arguing that being a generalist is a bad thing. It just, in this arena, requires sort of a pretty bought-in learning culture, because you're going to then be like the person, the go-to person for everything. And that means learning's happening all the time, which is a good thing. But a lot of organizations don't necessarily value someone sitting next to someone and like just showing them something because it doesn't directly add value in a traditional like viewpoint of what we do from a day-to-day basis. So pick a narrow vertical if you're just starting out, and even as mid to senior level, such that you can be the person that kind of lays the groundwork for a learning culture. Second approach or tactic, I would say, would be to find a forum, some kind of forum. What do I mean by a forum? So it could look lots of different ways: lightning talks, conference talks, meetups, book clubs, hackathons. Realize the Petri dish is probably a little sus considering everything we've got going on, but that's okay. And, and my favorite, pair programming. This might be something that doesn't seem like a learning forum, but I actually think it's where most of the learning happens. Who has a pair programming culture in their current job? Among you, who is all the time pairing? Nice. I'm not really dogmatic on 100% or not. I just think that, or I know from my experience, that's where most of my pairing, PAI, most of my learning took place right next to someone whose personality I had to mesh with or figure out how to work around. But the talk is called Learning the Hard Way, so if that's hard, it's supposed to be. Okay, my strategy is, if an internal forum exists for you to do that, like if you do have pairing culture, if you do have hackathons, if you do have lightning talks at your place of work, use them. But when you go in to use them, don't try to immediately change how everything goes. You have to come in and observe how things are so that you can honor the efforts of people who created it before you, which is why she's walking to the door, opening the door, getting things started. It's good feedback. If I have to explain the emoji, that means I should probably pick different ones. Good. So one thing to note is external forums can be like a distraction from the workplace. That's kind of a caveat. Or, depending on how they're approached and supported, can really be a force multiplier. For example, maybe some of your company sent you to this, and if you come back with a really interesting insight, say about we should have a learning organization in our company, then this forum has become a force multiplier for you in that instance, or whatever else you might have learned from anyone else who's had a talk. And then finally, for the individuals, just going to give some pretty broad and macro level teaching tips. Whenever learning takes place, it rarely happens in a vacuum. You're not just learning about, let's say, class-based components, throwback. On their own, you're figuring out, how does that work within our architecture? Why would I do that? Or why should I not do that? What are the pros and cons of that? So keeping that in mind when you are either gleaning knowledge from someone else or sharing it out is really important, because otherwise you're really setting yourself up to be frustrated if it's this person just doesn't understand, or I just don't understand what they're saying. You both probably have a shared context where you can meet, and from there a lot of magic can happen. And then this goes back to the pair programming thing in some ways. Reflect on your communication style as well as its reception. By that, I just mean you have to somehow be getting feedback on how you deliver information or how it's given to you. That could be lots of things, like giving a talk when I watch it later, or truly just recording yourself at your desk if you're sharing something with someone, or there's lots of ways, right? I live streamed this talk on Tuesday and I watched it back and I learned oh, I was pretty high level. I don't have a lot of anecdotes, so I changed some things. And you can do that too with whatever it is you do. I've been recently live streaming myself on Twitch, building out the website for my business, and that's been a lot of fun. It's held me accountable, and it's also given me feedback on the business and also my delivery and all that, all of which is important. if you're about that life, learning. Blank slide. So now to the organizations part. Here's where I'm going to talk a bit about how organizations can implement some of what I'm calling best practices, and additionally providing some anecdotes for how I've seen this be successful in my career. So the first practice is to build programs incrementally. Maybe when you leave here, you might be fired up to be like, hey, we've got to build a boot camp within our company, and we need to do it by December. You're not going to be pleased with the result, most likely, because it takes a lot of energy to do that, to implement a new, completely new and novel department, and sometimes just thought process of learning. So you should be sure you're incremental with the building. A caveat to that is an example I'm going to talk about later. But the inherent risk that we took on at Home Depot to do this, it happened to work out, but it could have not. So back to being incremental. At USAA, what we did there was we would go there Monday through Friday for a 12-week period. We being myself and two other engineers/instructors, which we'll talk about in a second. 4 weeks of ILT, which is instructor-led training. So we were truly teaching them Spring Boot and React as a front end for 4 weeks, just the fundamentals of that. And then for the next 8 weeks, we would embed with their team, sit in on all ceremonies, pair with them, go to stand-up, all those things as if we were on the team. And that's more of like a hybrid approach because, you can see baked into this, there's maybe a little hesitancy to go full throttle 12 weeks because we don't have speaking from USA's perspective, we don't have the time to delay delivery for 3 months, right? But we can weave it in and do something a little more bespoke. And that was also a lot of fun for me as an engineer. So then more recently, I was doing some work with the Department of Defense. This is a program they have called Platform One, which is effectively their infrastructure as a service. What's so funny? The Yoda? It's good, right? Yeah, totally. Platform One is their infrastructure as a service and also kind of an ethos of how they wanted to do things. You can think of it as like the Space Force's digital transformation, right? Really? So there's a few different prongs there. We had onboarding for new contractors. Maybe somebody worked at, Lockheed or something like that, and they needed to build on this system, so they'd go to our onboarding. We also did a 6-week blended learning cohort. If you're not familiar with blended learning, it's putting most of the onus, almost all the onus of learning on the learner themselves, rather than this like, hey, this is that from an instructor. And then we also did a 12-week program with them, which, is anybody not familiar with the bootcamp model of 12 weeks? You learn to code from scratch. Nice. I didn't say you up for success by asking for a negative. Are you not? So I understand. Okay, cool. So yeah, that's just another anecdote of how we were able to build incrementally. So the thing about that is, or the reason why you should build incrementally is because you want to get data. Like, you don't want to be delaying the amount of information you can collect because you're spending a lot of time creating the thing. So if you start small, then you're able to, as it says, identify an appropriate program that you can meet the desired interests in the community if there is one, which there hopefully is. So get a little bit of data before you start to build out a whole hung game program. And then this part's actually really difficult, is to constantly observe the inputs and outputs. So at Galvanize, which was the company I was working with, Department of Defense and USAA, we had this LMS called Learn, which I learned maybe like other people use. They sold it as a product that gave us information about somebody's completion level of a certain module. We had assessments that we could track their performance in, and that's just like one metric. We also were observing them in class, getting subjective data, having smaller sessions, breakout rooms where we would see how folks interacted with each other, because of course there's a interpersonal component to learning as well. It's not just technical skills, yeah. But that part's really hard. I don't take that lightly. So the third best practice is, initially it was going to be facilitator, create forums. I could have said that, right? But I didn't. I said facilitate the creation of forums. A couple people on TikTok, I see. So this is where I'm going to talk a bit about what we were doing at Home Depot. And that was something that we decided to call Orange Method. Is anybody from Home Depot here or no? Oh, but you know, Sydney, shout out to Sydney. So if you didn't know, Home Depot has an internal boot camp called Orange Method, wherein you can, let's say you worked at Home Depot store, you could apply to this program, and if accepted, you would be going to the office in Marietta daily and learning how to build software, even if you have no experience building software, which is really cool. One, because that person, whether they worked at a store or a call center or a distribution center, is much closer to the data that we're building platforms and systems for than we would be as engineers. So you get that empathy, that ability to do like really high touch point user-centered design. And then also for these people, in some cases, for those individuals, it's like a 2 or 3x salary bump, which is always nice to a point. So yeah, there's just some photos of what we built. So back to the earlier point about, I was saying build incrementally. This is the opposite of that. We took an entire wing of a campus and what do they call it? Like demoed it. Knocked down walls, glass walls for the outside, built specifically just for classrooms, projected, like very much like this room. And that's expensive. That's really expensive. So it's not something that, I'm not necessarily recommending that approach. I'm saying it did work. It was high risk. We knew, though, that we had a lot in our favor. We had like hundreds of thousands of people in the field, either at stores or distribution centers or call centers. And we also knew we had a lot of open recs, so it's like, why not fill them with these people? And the reason not to fill them is because you don't have the capability to like actually learn and like shepherd them through this learning journey. But if you do, then you can do that. Yeah, just some more classroom photos. What we did was we had, again, everybody working in pairs, took the extreme programming model and scaled that, made it the way we did things. That's a lot of fun. Shout out to Amit for being camera aware, but not so much Jesse for not paying attention. That's okay. Uh-oh. Escape. Classic. Good. So if you were wondering, that's a lot of face. I didn't think about that, my bad. If you were wondering if this works remotely, yes, it does. That's Heather, don't know their names. And these people up here are this person's here in Georgia, but they're in Detroit, and we taught a Python class to them remotely. It was an all-day workshop that was pretty successful. They gave us good reviews on that. Obviously, I'm not really talking too much about like the pedagogy or approaches to teaching in the classroom, because this talk would be hours long if I were to do that, but giving you high level to show you that, it's possible. So back to facilitating the creation of forums. How much friction is there at your company to get a blog post put up on the engineering blog, for example? Do you even have the permission to do that? Is there a process for creating spaces where people can bounce their ideas off of each other? Does the company participate in open source? These are all things that are a part of a learning program. You might even think about it as developer relations turned inward. Yes. Are we sharing our findings with the community at large? Or are we hoarding information because we're afraid that somebody's going to learn our technique? But we really know it's not the technique, it's the persistence. Do engineers have a sanctioned and supported place to learn and practice new skills? I hope that the answer is yes. That's the hope. So these efforts can really have a big cultural impact, especially, there's no X, like espresso. Especially when you think about people in early career and populations that may have been overlooked historically. And this gets into the work I was doing with Checker. Shout out to Katrina in the front row. Go to the Checker booth if you haven't. Really great company and great people to work with and for. What having a learning program can do is ease the on-ramp and widen the aperture for folks in the beginning of their career, because a lot of the aversion to hiring folks who are new to the game is that they're not going to know what to do. But yeah, that's right, because they're just started. So it's incumbent upon the organizations that want to grow and build fast to make sure that there's a place for those folks to land. And this is a lot of the work that I was beginning to do at Checker, which was building out an onboarding program and thinking about how we could invert the levels, the distribution of levels, which we'll talk about here in a second. Whoops. So this is how a lot of organizations are structured. These emojis and their requisite like facial features are not meant to reflect age, rather amount of experience in programming, right? So here's a newly minted engineer in however way. But you can see that this leveling ratio is problematic. There's like 1 entry-level engineer, 1 early career engineer, 3 mid-levels, and 4 seniors. Does anybody's org structure in any department look kind of like this, have this structure? Yeah, so that it could be problematic especially for this person, because they might feel either isolated socially or just like technically like, I don't know, I don't feel like I can contribute, right? And then what happens when one of these people leave? At the top, then you have like, how do you hire it? What usually happens is that person gets backfilled at the same level. But with a ratio like this, again, same energy with the emojis. This creates a scenario wherein these 4 individuals who are newer to the game have a perspective that these people may not have, because maybe they came from a different background. And the only way that's possible is if you are in an organization that supports being able to hire someone from a different educational, social, racial, gender, etc. background than from what we traditionally see in the safer approach. So with this, these 4 individuals at the bottom can see that there's a way up for them. Like, okay, if something happens in one of these levels or the team just grows, I can see how I could work my way up that ladder. And then if let's say the person at the top moves on to another part of their career, that's great. Then there's people who can fill that. Then it just lifts all boats. The rising tide argument might work here. Okay. Yes. So don't do that. And now here's the big one. All this sounds great, right? Maybe. But how are we going to incentivize this skill set? How do we find people who care about education enough to like really be about that life and commit to really the future of the company, right? It's not really a thing that we traditionally do in tech. I think we have a lot to learn from the developer relations side. Back to that point again. And I'm arguing that we need to turn that internally and have strictly like I know a lot of organizations have like developer productivity or what have you. I really like the Home Depot model of like building a school. So yeah, what does the career path for a learning engineer look like? You can't necessarily just map it to the software engineer path. It can't just be like learning engineer 1, learning engineer 2, unless you really rethink, the different levels and what's required for each level and how to progress there. These emojis represent the fact that you get a totally different skill set from someone who has the skill of being able to educate and facilitate learning journeys, tend to have a sense of calm and the ability to empathize with others and be in their shoes. And also, this doesn't mean, like these two things or even the education, doesn't mean that they're not technical or can't code, right? My last boss, Krista, one time she told me, she was like, you're not like, what did she say? She said, you're not like half teacher, half instructor. You're 50% manager, 50% instructor, and 50% engineer. I was like, Krista, that math. But I hear you. But I really needed to hear that because it's an important thing to not create this world where we're saying like, oh, you're only teaching because you can't do it, right? That's something I've sometimes internally struggle with. But it's like, no, this is like an actual skill that really is needed and can really make a big impact. Good, and then learning how to support the varied interests and values of a changing workforce. This should say the last one, that's not right. But what I'm saying here is that people coming into organizations now may not want the same things that we wanted or folks in the past wanted. Someone might really love the fact that they get to be the face of your Twitch channel. And that could be as equally important to them as a salary or some other thing. Or someone might love the fact that they get to go around and talk on behalf of the company about some initiative. And if we think about like little ways to incentivize that, we can create a culture where people, A, feel like they're being heard, and B, are able to learn and share their knowledge with others, which is very, very important. And feel engaged at work, because nobody wants to just come in and not feel a part of the program. Right, somebody feels me. Cool, so that's the end of the meat of the talk. So to summarize, individuals and organizations, in my view, both have a responsibility to be stewards of their learning paths, either, again, as individuals or as organizations, such that everything can be better for both of them. We want engagement from the individuals. We also want the organization to be creating a world where learning can happen and growth can take place internally. And it also makes, there's a whole talk to be had about how this affects hiring, and maybe that's another talk, but that's the work that I have been thinking about and doing since I've left Checker on May 13th. And I've been live streaming, as I said, the creation and building of this business, starting with the website on Twitch. That's what that QR code will take you to, no sus stuff. So I've been live streaming on Wednesday and Sunday at 9 a.m. until I'm done building the website or whatever else might need to happen. And the company's called Quarterly Learnings. If you'd like more information, you can email me at brandon@quarterlylearnings.com. This QR code is for my Twitter if you want to follow me there. Are there any questions? Yes.
I had a quick question. What do you do if you find that you don't have, like, let's say, a consistent person who's motivated to be kind of like a leader in learning? So we do like tech training for like all of our new hires, and we generally like rotate relatively experienced engineers to lead each new cohort. And I view the motivation for leading that as largely this is a path into getting promoted into a management position because you get that experience, but not all people want to lead a tech training to, move on in their career.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, how do you find like a mainstay?
Yeah. You don't want to be it?
Oh, I mean, I actually did lead one of these cohorts and actually really enjoyed it, but
Like in a consistent way. Does it like light you up in the same way that resolving a bug does? Like getting someone to that place of
yeah, within my project team, but not,
not writ large, right? I hear you.
In my project team, I've got a lot of impact. Like,
Got it.
Like when somebody understands our designs, they're able to carry out and see what the mission is. Love it.
Yeah.
When it comes to learning the technology, it's a little more general than that.
Respect. That's really interesting. When the way you described it, my brain went to immediately like having an embedded, I think this gets really messy at scale, but having an embedded like learning engineer on each team or something like that.
Okay.
Or really going to bat. I mean, we used to talk about like tech not being a cost center, right? I think we have to put that same energy into learning. You know what I mean? So like getting the buy-in from wherever it needs to happen to like it's a cultural shift to invest in this because it's not a trivial thing to have somebody full time thinking about this stuff.
So
I know.
Then each team, everybody's got like their narrow vertical.
That's an approach, yeah. But I mean, like outside of having a separate department, that's one thing I could think of. And I think the reason I said that is because it allows you to keep doing what you're doing, and maybe other people will see like, hey, I like that. Good question. Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to piggyback off what you said. Is there a way for you to create the program at your job to satisfy what satisfies you without doing that?
Right.
Maybe you would want to be the mainstay if your actual program gave you the same feelings that doing it for your team did.
That's it. That's good.
And maybe that's like a lack of incentivization on our part.
And it, yeah.
Yeah.
But just food for thought.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I think I agree with you because you have to change hearts and minds with this kind of stuff, even as corny as that sounds. Yes, Arando.
The question I'm posing is how do you emphasize to stakeholders and say business the importance of continuous learning to a youngish team, say less than 10 and you're under 2 years? How do you emphasize that to them considering that they want a product?
You're saying considering that the stakeholders want a product. I think that's exactly where you start. Because you get a better product if you have a broader set of perspectives. And the way to facilitate a broader set of perspectives is to continually be sharing those perspectives across a group of people.
All right, so if I'm supposed to summarize a scenario that I've been placed in, I'm a part of a team that we're still trying to figure out how important learning is. I'm former educator, so I get that. That's not something you need to expect. But talking to management about why things like this is important, it's not something they get. How do I get that to them?
Yeah. It's definitely going to be a hard battle. There's lots of examples. Facebook a few years ago like an internal dojo that they did all this about. I think Salesforce is doing something like this with like the Trailhead program. And there's also a lot of different examples wherein people have done other things like hired. For example, General Assembly, I know, is working with this bank in Minnesota called M&T Bank, I think. Capital One does this, where this is building an internal learning organization. So that might be an angle. Like our peers are doing this, like bona fide tech companies or banks or what have you, and is it working for them? But what does working look like? It could mean that these people feel fulfilled. These people have more agency in their day-to-day. Like there's lots of different data that you need to collect that's difficult, as I mentioned, to do. But I mean, there's a reason that so many people are putting energy into actual learning. And also looking at developer relations, once again, how that works from the outside to get people interested in the product or to help them ramp up to be able to use whatever tech you're building. Those people are just like the people that work at your company, so it possibly could work internally. You know what I mean? Good question. Yeah.
So it's more of an individual question.
Yeah.
I graduated a boot camp recently, and it sounds like you've worked with a lot of boot camp grads. You went through a boot camp program.
Yeah.
Do you have general good advice for kind of breaking that stigma of not having a degree, or like, is there a good technique to work towards selling yourself to a company, like, so that they'll give you a chance?
That's a really good question. That's something we talk about a lot. Well, I think it's really difficult to make the case from an individual perspective because you haven't gotten in and like gotten a role yet. To the earlier point, I think there's lots and lots of examples. Feel free to use this talk. I was Home Depot's first bootcamp hire, and I'd argue like had a pretty successful career there. There's lots of cases like that. That might be an approach. Going on Twitter, maybe search like bootcamp hire and see what people are saying. Or maybe companies are tweeting like, oh, we are open to hiring XYZ. Go on LinkedIn, see what people say, and then collect that and make the case. Additionally, just continuing to show up yourself, like, you know, coding every day. Make sure your GitHub's on point. Maybe tweet.
Keep the grind going, build the skills, make apps.
Yeah, I really hate for that to be my answer, but in some ways that's it. But also a cultural shift does have to take place on the hiring side, yes.
I was just going to speak to that. I do think bootcamp hiring is cultural at specific companies, but this is just a plug for BlackRock. On my team, we have...
I knew she was coming with it.
We have directly had bootcamp hires on teams that I work with, so we, culturally, we are very open to people coming from other backgrounds. So if anybody else is boot camp or in
The
general.
BlackRock and the clicker?
Checker.
Sorry.
Let's go. Building connections. Oh. There we go. So yeah, if you love fintech or fair chance hiring, there's two people right there. Yeah, well, one more, and then I think I've got to go.
I've seen a lot of companies at a turning point where they're doing some training, the senior engineer trains the junior engineers on the team, and then they have trouble flipping for their responsibilities. The top priority is individual contribution, and then that means they'll never have time to teach effectively. And some companies have flipped it, and it's hard to get that to be, oh, your first priority teaching. If you have free time, you can also code. Do you have any stories of that kind of transformation handy?
Yeah, 100%. At Home Depot, it happened to me internally. And because when I first started working on Orange Method, I was the founding engineer, right? So the last thing I was doing was building microservices in Node.js and like Ruby on Rails. So in my head, I'm like, I'm out here, I'm a coder, you know? But then when it's every day building curricula or teaching, I had to really like call myself into question, like, am I though? That's an internal imposter syndrome, right? But then I had to zoom out and see the broader impact. I'm touching like all these different lives and careers who will then move on and have a broader impact at the company. And I think keeping that top of mind and making that the top line argument when you go to make the case for whichever side of that flip you prefer is what's really important. I think it's difficult to get buy-in for like, hey, I'm just going to be focused on learning, but you might have a different experience. I think if you do have that buy-in, I would go that direction. Because you can always, like, I know, I can always go continue to write code. Like, you don't lose it after a while. But, like, you know, just keep practicing, and you'll always have that skill. But the new thing of the learning, I think there's more marginal increase to be had on that side. Okay. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you around.